Okay, class, in this lesson, we're going to talk about stock splits. We're going to learn to calculate the post-split outstanding shares and share price for both a traditional and reverse splits, and calculate the fractional value amount that a shareholder receives after a split. Okay, so why do corporations split stocks? Okay, well, to understand this question about why corporations split stocks, we need to first understand what a stock split is and then what happens when a split occurs. So a stock split is when you take a share and split it into two equal parts. So for example, let's say we have one share of stock that is worth $20. When it's split, it becomes two shares of stocks worth $10 each. This is called a 2-for-1 split, also known as a traditional stock split. The investor gets 2 shares for every one share held, while the price per new share is cut in half. So essentially, the value has not changed. It's just that instead of having 1 share, you now have 2 shares, but the value is still the same. Now, that is a traditional stock split. In a reverse stock split, the effect is just the opposite. The number of outstanding shares is reduced and the market price per share is increased. For example, let's say 1 share of stock is $2. In a 1-for-2 split, the investor would now own 1 share, now worth $4, for every 2 previously held shares. Now, the total number of all shares issued by a corporation that are in investors' hands are called outstanding shares. The total value of all of a company's outstanding shares is called market capitalization, or market cap. So in both scenarios described earlier, the 2-for-1 split and the 1-for-2 split, the market cap does not change. However, what does change is the perception. So if a stock is viewed as expensive initially, then an investor is less likely to buy a share. However, if the share price were to be cut in half or more, this increases the likelihood of investor buying a share. So this is where the perception takes place. Now, the opposite is also true. If a share of a stock is considered cheap, for example, penny stocks, whose value is less than $5 per share, investors may not want to buy those shares because it's considered cheap. However, in a 1-for-2 split, for example, it would make the stock seem to have more value even though the market cap is the same. And as a result, it may increase the number of investors investing in those shares. So the saying perception is reality holds true for the stock market. Although stock splits may not initially alter the value of shares held, the perception of change may lead to increases in sales and market prices. Okay, so let's take a look at the first example and understand some of the math behind this. So on April 9th, Starbucks Corporation, their symbol is SBUX, instituted a 2-for-1 stock split. Okay, so before the split, the market share price was $95.30 per share, and the corporation had 749 million shares outstanding. What was the pre-split market cap for Starbucks? Okay, so to determine this, we're going to say that the pre-split market cap is equal to the number of shares times market price. Okay, so then to determine the pre-split market cap, we're going to take the number of shares, which is 749 million shares outstanding, and we're going to multiply that by $95.30. $0.30. Okay, now punching that in the calculator, we would get 71,379,700,000. So that is our pre-split market capitalization. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to example 2. So this is referring to example 1. Now the next question is, what was the post-split number of shares outstanding for Starbucks? Okay. Well, the pre-split number of shares was 749 million. And post-split, it was a 2-for-1 split, so it essentially doubled. So we're going to multiply this number of shares by 2. And punching this in the calculator, we would get 1,498,000,000 shares outstanding, okay? Or we would write 1.498B. So that would be the answer for the post-split number of shares outstanding. All right, now in example 3, the question here is, what was the post-split market price per share for Starbucks from example 1? How many shares are outstanding, and did the market cap change after the split? Okay, now to look at the post-split market price, we would have to take the pre-split market price, which was $95.30. And since it was a 2-for-1 split, we would divide this number by 2. And that would result in $47.65. Okay, so that is the post-split market price per share. Okay, how many shares are outstanding? Well, we just calculated that in example 2. That is the 749 million shares outstanding times 2, and that gives us 1.498 billion shares. And did the market cap change after the split? The post-split market cap is 47.65 times the 1.498 billion, and that equals 71,379,700,000, which is the same number as it was before, right? Because it was $95.30 per share, and there were 749 million shares, and that also works out to 71,379,700,000. Let me go ahead and finish those numbers. Okay, so did the market cap change after the split? The answer is no. Okay, let's move on to example 4. On May 9th, Citigroup Inc., their symbol is C, instituted a 1-for-10 reverse stock split. So before the split, the market share price was $4.48, and there were 29 billion shares. The question is, what was the post-split share price and number of shares? All right, so there were 29 billion shares before the split. Since this was a 1-for-10 reverse stock split, we would have to divide this by 10. Remember, a reverse stock takes the number of shares and reduces the number of shares. And so we would divide this by 10. And in doing so, the number of shares outstanding would be 2.9 billion. Shares outstanding. Okay, and the share price, well, it was originally $4.48. Okay, since this is a 1-for-10 reverse stock split, the value increases by 10. So we multiply this by 10. And now the share price, the new share price is $44.80. Okay, $2.9 billion, 2.9 billion shares outstanding at $44.80 per share. And as you could see, if you were to calculate the market capitalization, that has not changed between pre-split versus post-split. Okay, now, one other thing, and this is called a fractional part of a share. In the previous examples, we had shares that could be split into whole number amounts, but in reality, this may not always be the case. Often the split would create what's called a fractional part of a share. So in other words, there's less than one share remaining. In these situations, the company or the corporation buys the fractional share at the current market price. And that's how they resolve fractional part of a share. So let's take a look at example number 5 and see how this works. So in this example, Steve owned 942 shares of a manufacturing company. On January 3rd, a 5-for-4 split was announced. So the stock was selling at $56 per share before the split, and the question is, how was Steve financially affected by the split? Okay, so I didn't use this equation earlier because the calculation was fairly straightforward. But in this case, because this is a 5-for-4 split, I'm going to use the following equation, and that is post-split number of shares is going to be equal to what's called A over B times the pre-split number of shares. Okay, now the A over B is just that 5-for-4 split. So the A is the 5, that's the first number that was presented in the split. And then that would be divided by 4, which is the second number that comes in the split. And we're going to multiply this by 942 shares that Steve owns. Okay. And punching this in the calculator, that works out to 1,177.5 shares. Okay. Now, that's one component. The other component that we need to calculate is what's called the post-split share price, right? We have number of shares and we also have the share price. And that's going to equal, and the fraction is a little bit different this time. This is going to be B over A times the pre-split share price. Okay, now both of these equations, the post-split number of shares and the post-split share price, you can use this equation for the previous examples that we worked on. Okay, I didn't feel that it was necessary, but because this is an odd type of split, this now needs to come into play. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to understand. Okay. So the post-split share price is going to be B over A. So the second number comes first this time. So it'll be 4 over 5 times the pre-split share price, which was $56. Okay, punching that into the calculator, that works out to $44.80 per share. All right, so since fractional shares are not traded, the corporation will end up paying him the market value of half a share. Okay, so let me go ahead and write this equation down. The fractional part times market price. Okay, so that's going to equal the fractional part. If you notice here, when we calculated the post-split number of shares, there's a 0.5. Okay, so the corporation is going to take that 0.5 and we're going to multiply that by the post-split share price, which is $44.80. Okay, and punching that in the calculator, that works out to $22.40. Okay, so after the split, Steve will receive $22.40 in cash and 1,177 shares worth $44.80. Okay, so the 1,177 shares is what's remaining because the corporation is going to pay him half a share at this price. So what he's going to get is this much in cash. He's going to be left with this many shares at $44.80. Okay, hopefully that made sense. If any of this was confusing, please go back to the beginning of the recording and listen to it again. Thank you.